also have the challenge of conflict on the continent, which is a drain on human and material resources. It's true that when you do a head count in terms of conflict, you would see that the number of conflicts may have diminished, because we very well remember that not too long ago, countries such as Liberia, Sierra Leone, Angola, even the Democratic Republic of Congo at one point had 9 countries fighting inside the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Mozambique, and Southern Sudan. Not too long ago, those were major conflicts on the African continent. I'm happy to know that today, a lot of these conflicts have been resolved, even if we still have very fragile states for some of the countries that I mentioned. But at the same time, we have the ongoing genocide in Darfur, and the very fragile nature of the state of Sudan, with impending elections coming up this year and the referendum in 2011. We still have atrocities being committed and gross violations and rape of women in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, a situation that causes lives, loss of lives on a daily basis. We now have Somalia, which has been a failed state for over a decade, and which is now posing an international threat of piracy, not just to Africa, but to the world at large in a way that is disrupting commercial routes for all of the world. So as long as these conflicts continue to persist, Africa is going to continue to lose out in terms of its human capital as well as natural resources. It's also going to lose out in terms of the image, the public image that the rest of the world has on the African continent. Because lest we forget, the Ghanas, the Malis, the Benin, the South Africa that I cited, all most of the time get eclipsed in the media, in the news, by what's happening in the conflict areas that I just mentioned. And so until we as Africans can clean up our act completely, we're going to be in a situation where the rest of the world looks at Africa through the prism of some of these existing conflicts. Today, we're very worried about Niger, with the stance that has been taken by President Tanja. We're very worried about Guinea-Conakry, and the need for a return to civilian democratic government in that country. We're even very worried about the situation in Nigeria, where the Niger Delta, the tensions in the Niger Delta have not been fully resolved, and where we have a lot of young, able-bodied men, for the most part, running around with guns that could be very destabilizing, not just for Nigeria, which is 140 million Africans, but for other African countries within the Gulf of Guinea, which many of you may know is the principal supplier of oil resources to most of the world, most of the developing world. The fourth challenge that I see for our continent of Africa is the challenge of poor management of resources. Mark you that I don't say poverty, I say it's the poor management of resources. Because for me, Africa is not a poor continent. What is crippling the continent is the poor manner in which we manage our resources, the poor manner in which we manage our human capital, the fact that people are not given opportunities to make a contribution by way of public service based on merit and what they can bring, but based on other relationships. The fact that what is supposed to come into the public treasury in many countries ends up not in the public treasury, ends up not even in the financial services of those countries, but ends up in foreign bank accounts in countries that are already doing well and that don't need those deposits coming from African leaders. Some of you may have read just in this week a report that was that has been issued by the US Senate on money laundering within the United States, in which a number of African leaders have been cited by name with very concrete proof of ways in which they've embezzled resources from their own countries. In one case, which was really pathetic, a US bank discovered that in the deposit box of the bank was in cash an amount of $1 million that had been deposited in the deposit box of the bank by a young lady whose father happened to be a head of state and who had just brought her in cash $1 million while she is studying in the United States. Yet in that country, there are people who cannot afford to live on more than $2 a day. That, for me, is part of the drama of our continent. When you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo today, it's a country of tremendous resources. Minerals, including minerals that are not found anywhere else in the world. But yet, this country has not succeeded in its governance, and it's in a situation that is so fragile that some of the little minor gains in terms of democratic governance may not be consolidated. When you look at Equatorial Guinea, for example, Equatorial Guinea has a population of around 500,000 people, which is probably the population of one of the small German cities. But Equatorial Guinea is the third largest oil exporting country on the African continent, coming after Nigeria and Angola. That's a country in which every citizen will be a major shareholder in any one of the multinationals around the world. But there is abject poverty in Equatorial Guinea, and that's wrong. Look at a country like Gabon. It's a very wealthy country, but its citizens are not wealthy. In the last few years, we've seen that the Gulf of Guinea has been expanding in terms of oil finds. Today, we're in a situation where almost all African countries, from Mauritania on the west coast, down to Angola, along all of that coastline, and even countries in the interior, such as Chad, and maybe even Central African Republic, maybe, and Congo-Brazzaville, of course, would be oil-producing countries in the not-too-distant future. The question that is out there is whether these countries and the governments that are in power at this point will be able to put in place mechanisms that will allow their citizens to benefit from this natural resource. My worry is that if we don't reverse the trend that we see in terms of the poor management of our resources, that Africans will continue to live in abject poverty, and that is a major challenge to both economic and political development. The last challenge that I see for the African continent is the lack of opportunities for our young people. The demographics in Africa are in favor of the young generation. Many of you, when you visit the continent, see all these young men and women roaming the streets, selling things by the roadsides in the cities. Most of them are well educated, some of them have got university diplomas, but they just cannot find opportunities to make a living for themselves. That's why the whole question of immigration with regards to Africans trying to leave the continent, some at all costs, some as cargo in planes, some on ships, it's an issue because people risk their lives trying to look for a better opportunity elsewhere at a time when the continent is not providing those opportunities. The demographics of our continent today show that over 50% of the African population is less than 20 years old. In some countries like Mali, like Uganda, those figures are even higher. If we, as Africans and friends of Africa, do not help create opportunities for the younger generation, then we're just building up for trouble. Because when I see in Zimbabwe, for example, President Mugabe, who is 83 years old, and he's not alone, because there are others who are in that age bracket, hang on to political power at a time when their own children and grandchildren are moving around unemployed. That definitely is a recipe for disaster. And I think that is something that we all should be working towards as Africans and as friends of Africa.